Welcome to the BEZA Performance Livestream. Today is S&OP Thursday, and once again, we'll be talking about S&OP with Doug Dedman, the president of DBM Systems. Let me get Doug up here. Welcome, Doug.
Hey, good to be here, Marshall.
Kind of excited about this. This will be a kickoff. Kickoff meaning we're going to do about 9 episodes on one topic, which is what does good look like. Whoops, my bad. Here he is.
I was going to say clearly good looks better when I'm not on. Good looks better when I'm not on the screen. Is that how it works?
I guess what does good look like? Take Doug off.
Yeah.
So what does good look like for S&OP? And we'll get into kind of everything today. Just kind of preview where we're going and talk about the way we ought to think about S&OP if we want to talk about what is good. So let me level set like we always do and talk about what we define S&OP as. It's the president's handle on the business. It allows a clear link between strategy and execution. It allows you to set the flow rate for the business by family, and there's a participation of the president or the executive that handles the business in that. And that's not a report out. It's establishing clear, responsible, and accountabilities within the RACI model. That's the two we focus on. It is repeatable and regular, like you do it every month and you've got a rhythm with it, and then it gets better and you get better. So the more you do S&OP, the more the business gets better and the more your S&OP process gets better. So why don't you tee it up? What's on your head today about what good looks like?
Yeah. It's great that I mean, we've been kind of doing that on a regular basis, that you kind of go through those outputs about the, S&OP being management's handle on the business. And really today, what we're talking about is how do you take those concepts that are mentioned in those key characteristics, and how do you kind of make sure that kind of where the rubber hits the road, right? Like, how do you make sure this is what's actually happening? And so, if I look at it from the very starting point of the measure of a good executive S&OP process, is that the person that's in charge of and running the business, the head honcho, the big cheese, whatever you want to call them, your CEO typically, is actually running the process, or is using that process, engaged in it. I was a little bit late coming on today for you and I to meet, because that was one of the things that we were just speaking about with one of our clients. And what I'm seeing in their process is they've got to the point where that senior executive that runs this business that's across multiple locations, he's actually the one who's running the process in the executive meeting, right? So he's the one who's really kind of driving the conversation, using the data that's been brought forward to him into that meeting. And really that starts to be what good S&OP looks like.
And that's a big business. I mean, if you're thinking, I run, a $10 billion business, there's no way I can do that. This is, in that size range. And it took a long time for that executive to kind of make the connection, even though we talked about it a lot. Executives are busy. So until they connect S&OP the way you're describing it as the way they run the business, so that it saves them time, it doesn't cost them time, then they typically like to just get a report out from the S&OP process. So I'm excited that client is doing that.
And it's great to hear literally talking heads, because that's what we are right now. But talking heads, like me talking about, okay, well, hey, great, they're doing this. What we wanted to do was just spend a little bit of time and look at how do we get there. And one of the things is, if that's not happening in your executive S&OP process, really the question you got to ask is why. Right. Yeah. And so that's a little bit of what we want to touch on today. And so just if you can bring up my screen for a second, just a kind of quote to pick up a little bit from what, you brought the characteristics up. But S&OP's got to be a management decision-making process. So that's a pretty important part. It's got to be a decision-making process that provides management that ability to strategically direct their business and achieve a competitive advantage on a continuous basis. So that's kind of a motherhood and apple pie piece. But the thing I wanted to say out of that was important is about it being a decision-making process, and it's got to be owned by the senior management. And it's something that you do on a continuous basis. And so what I wanted to do today was kind of dive into kind of 8 areas that are things that would improve that executive engagement and get you to the
Right.
level of being able to have that conversation. Um, one of the things about this is, why is this so important for us to have this conversation? Is because unlike other initiatives that you go through in your organization, like change initiatives, we always say, hey, you have to have executive sponsorship for this to happen. This is actually the executive's process, right? So it's not just
Yeah.
executive sponsorship, it's that executive ownership. And how do you get that? And if you don't get to that point, you're not really unlocking that full potential out of the S&OP process. So to start off with, I just wanted to ask, just a couple questions. If you're sitting there today and you're looking at your S&OP process and you're going, well, okay, I want to hear, what does good look like? Here's kind of a couple questions you can use to think about the process. So the first one is your executive meeting a report out, or is it a decision-making meeting? And you probably know what I mean, the difference between that. A report out, we're just kind of going through the slides and everybody's going, yeah, uh-huh, yeah, uh-huh. Decision-making process is something that we're really engaging in that conversation. There's typically a lot of ebb and flow and back and forth as you go through there, because I don't know about the people that are listening to this, but most of the businesses that we're working with right now have some sort of conflict in the organization between supply capability and demand, right?
Yeah.
They're kind of dealing with those things, whether it's supply chain issues, whether it's, man, we can't get resources, those side of things. So that's the first question. So ask yourself that question. We want it to be a decision making process. So the how good it is kind of starts. Is it actually a decision making process?
So can we park on that just for a bit and
Yeah.
just I know what people are going to say in some cases. They're going to say, if I don't bring those to the executive meeting, my executive is going to be angry, those decisions. And we're not saying that, right? We're not saying you don't bring what you think the best shot is for the business. So what are we saying? I think that's a real important distinction.
Yeah, no, it's a good point. And if you're good with me parking it for a little bit, I'll
Okay.
come back to that one as we come to it. But yeah, it is an important piece to say, yeah, we want to be engaged in that meaningful conversation versus just blessing what's there. I'll come
Right.
back to that one. If I don't answer that question, Marshall, you are fully within your right to come back at me and say, hey, Doug, you never answered my first question. And yeah,
Will
we'll go
do.
back there. How's that sound?
Sounds good.
The other one on this is, can you get through your entire business in about 1 to 1.5 hours? And that's a big one. And
Yeah,
this
that is.
puts a lot of onus on the preparation and how you actually present the data, how you go through that. And a bunch of people might be saying, well, there's no way we can do that.
Right.
I'm here to tell you, working with business, $500 million businesses, up to $1 billion businesses, even small. Sometimes the smaller businesses are harder,
Yeah.
but but you get to the point where you can get to that, have a meaningful conversation in that period of time. If you're finding, man, we're not getting to it in that time, then I would say there's some things that you can do to make your process better. This is another one that's pretty. Oh, go ahead. Sorry,
No, go
Marshall.
ahead. Good.
I was
Keep
just going
going.
to say the other one that's that's pretty important is when the meeting's over, does everyone walk out of the meeting on the same page? And what I mean is, are we all in agreement of where we're going and what those decisions, or if the whole process was presented and we just had to talk about it in there, but did everyone come out of that meeting on the same page?
Yeah.
Right? Pretty important piece of that. And
Well,
then
marching orders, right? It's not that they all know what the numbers said. It's that they're expecting them. They're expected and expecting themselves to go execute. They're going to go try and make that
right.
supply plan happen. Not too often we see the S&OP process as sort of a viewed as maybe a suggestion, and then the supply team goes out and does whatever they do. They
Yep.
completely ignore the supply plan and just focus on a SKU level forecast or something. So
Yep.
that's really not what it's for.
Absolutely.
You're supposed to
And
go execute the supply plan and the sales
yep.
plan and the, yeah.
And I mean, this gets real critical as you're adding new products in. So it's, all of those things have got to come out of that where everybody goes, yep, this is what we're doing. And so that's an important one. So ask yourself that question. And then the final
Right.
one, which really is the one that we kind of hit at the very beginning, but comes to that point, is your senior executive engaged, right? Like, are they actually driving the meeting? And that was the conversation I had just before this, is that
Mm.
the S&OP coordinator is really facilitating the meeting, but the conversation is being driven by the senior executive. That means that they're looking around the room and they're saying, hey, we're talking about sales. Marshall, let's talk about what are the, they're driving that conversation on that side. Okay, now operations, Bob, what's going on the operations side of things? And so that's really that important. Are they engaged? Are they not just passive in the room? Are they really driving to what that is? So I just wanted to kick off the discussion on this with really those 4 questions. So if you're thinking about how well does it work, think about what the answer is to those 4 questions. And then what I thought I would do is jump into, and as you said, Marshall, we're only going to touch on these today, but I want to go through kind of I called them, for lack of something else, because I always had to put a title on a slide, was introducing the big 8. So
Yeah.
kind of stole my thunder. There's 8 of them, 8 kind of areas. This is not everything about S&OP. But if I think about S&OP as being a management process, which means it may take some cultural change in my organization, but it includes how I look at data, how I go through the whole process. Here's kind of the 8 areas that I think when you're thinking about what good looks like. I'm going to touch on these and give some, just a brief little bit about each one in terms of what they are. So unless there's any questions on the stuff I kicked off there, I don't know if I've answered your other question yet. I've got it in the back of my mind, so we'll hopefully come back to that if I don't. All right. So looking at the big 8 in areas, and obviously the first one on there, executive engagement and ownership. And really, we've really talked about this already as being a critical thing. And that was where I put that one question out there. Is the person running the business using the executive meeting as a critical management meeting? And so you can tell this by, and this is why we're advocates of saying, hey, schedule the meetings out for at least 6 months, get it in everybody's calendar, get it as a regular cadence so that it's happening on a regular basis. And so it's the meeting. It's the if I go back to some of the folks we worked with years ago, they would say, it was the can't miss meeting. Everybody had to be there. That was the place where all of the decisions and stuff were made. And so you've got to be there. And so the key points of addressing this one is, number one, are they always there? Right now,
Yeah.
always is a hard word, but you know what I mean,
Always
right?
is it's a real word though. Yep.
Yeah, it's a real word, and we would say they always attend, they're there, or they've actually got a delegate that's there, right?
Yeah. And mostly the former, not the latter.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep. So that they run the meeting. They're actually holding the team accountable. So that was kind of my example. Hey, Marshall, we're going to talk about sales. If you're the one who's responsible for that, well, then I'm going to actually be engaged in that conversation there and expect you to have the answers that I'm looking for in that. Right. So that's a big part of that. And at the end of it, they sign off on the plan. So the idea that everybody walks out, they're the ones who say, yep, I'm good with these plans. And so that means the plan has to be presented in a way that everybody understands that. So on this first one, I put it as number 1 because it's so important, but often it is the culmination of some of the ones that come behind them. So I don't want you to think of my number 1 through 8 as, oh, I got to do them in that order. I just put that one because to me, that's the fundamental thing about making this an effective
It's
process.
yeah, it's
It's
pretty
got to be
broken if that's not happening. It may work, but it's got some issues. So I think the
Yep.
other thing I would point out about executive engagement, it's a we're hired to help people get to good S&OP processes with executive engagement. And from day one, that's on the table. And sometimes it takes a while. It's not, even the executive will say, I want to, be engaged. But living that out is a little different than I think most people think. And then certainly if we're engaged well, we usually won't even do those projects, but if we're engaged with an executive that's not interested in being engaged, then that's a bit harder. And so I think if somebody's watching and thinking about, my executive's not engaged, this is a report out for them. It's sort of an operations exercise, maybe, demand planning operations. um, I think it'd be good to kind of talk about what the best way to get them involved
Yep.
is. To me, though, one simple answer is start working on everything, make it all better. And a bad S&OP process is like a bad party. And if you keep inviting people to bad parties, they quit coming to the party. So fix everything else too, and then make your process better, and it becomes more impactful. And then the executive is going to see the value. What
Yeah.
are your thoughts on that? That's just my take, but
No,
what?
no, I think, and really, I put this as number one, but it's really, it goes back to what I was saying before. If they're not engaged and we're running the process, I think we really need to look at the other seven things on this list, and probably six of
Yeah.
them as being what ones are the stumbling blocks for us to getting to that point. And so I put this as the big one because what does good look like? If you're not doing this, I would say you're not getting everything you can out of the S&OP process. Um, because otherwise it becomes either an operations meeting or a sales meeting, because we're going to be concerned about the things that we're concerned about,
Yeah.
as opposed to be looking at the whole business and thinking about it on that side. So I won't go any more onto that one, but we'll spend some time on that one. It's probably not the first one we'll spend
Okay.
some detailed time on,
Yeah.
but I think the next one that to me ultimately comes down to is the family structure. And you can think about the family structure simply as being, so you S&OP families is thinking about, how do I break the business up into the proper chunks, right? Or pieces that will support the decision making process, right?
Yeah.
That's ultimately what we're trying to do with the family structure, is to do that. And so if you're thinking about what good looks like on this, the first thing I would say to you is that family needs to be based on a constraint. And we'll spend
Yeah.
more time about that, talking about that, at some point in time in the future when we get to the family one, which we'll sort of see what order we end up doing these in. But it's got to be by constraint, because ultimately, if you think about it, and we've talked about this on the demand side of things, right, is we can come up with a demand plan that's maybe this big, but I've got to know, can I actually meet that demand, right?
Yeah.
And so if my capability is only this and I consolidate all my demand, it looks like this, I'm now in a constrained situation,
I
right?
mean,
Or
it's
if
really
I've got,
ultimately what S&OP is for, right? Like
it is ultimately that. Yeah.
reconciling the constraints in a real world scenario. Like you got to make decisions, and you got to make
Yep.
you got to ask the right questions to make the right decisions, and the right family structure is going to force you to look at those questions.
Right. And it's about getting to the right level of granularity. So the family structure goes back to my question about, can you get through the business in 1 to 1.5 hours? Well, if your families are really, really small, that's
Yeah.
going to be really, really hard, right?
Yeah.
Then you're probably
45
into a,
families is
yes,
not
then you're
going to
into
do it.
a minutia of detail that is not necessarily going to engage the president. So
Yeah.
there's always a trade-off, right? And so, if I'm too granular, I get too much detail. If I'm not granular enough, it's not meaningful. And that's why that constraint piece is, to me, is such a critical piece to start with.
Yeah.
So family structure is kind of my, outside of the executive engagement, having the right family structure is part of what gets you there. And so that way you can set all of those decisions. Going back to the decision making process, the points you went through at the beginning of this, setting the flow rate for the business is about dealing with a constraint and setting a flow rate for
By
that
family.
constraint. right, by family
Yeah.
that then ties to the demand.
It,
So
so if your family isn't constraint based, if it's, as we frequently see it is set up so it's kind of market facing, then you really don't know. I mean, your constraint decisions are coming somewhere in there. I don't know how it works exactly in every situation, but without the families being constraint based, then you just make it hard on yourself. You make it very difficult for somebody to say, that's a good way to handle that constraint or a poor way because it's not mapping back to the
yeah,
doability of the execution.
well, and to me, what you just said comes back to my one question about everybody coming out of the meeting with the same,
Yeah,
agreement on the same plan, right? Because if I don't explicitly kind of spell it out, saying demand, supply, what my buffers are in between them, and I actually see it there, I'm kind of leaving that interpretation and where somebody wants to go to them to walk out of the meeting.
yeah,
So right, and to do it because I'm going to have to do it someplace, and I might, so that's a key part, and I'll come back to that one again when I talk about the actual presentation. So family structure is pretty darn important. The next one is the monthly process, and here I don't stray very far at all from what Tom Wallace has talked about.
right.
Kind of the multi-step process. But think about this: is the purpose of this of the monthly process and why it's a month. The best analogy I can think of this is thinking about like a football play, right? Is like we called a play, we then tried to execute the play. It hopefully happened the way we want to, but there's this other problem because we're playing against a team who might not do exactly what we wanted them to do. And so we had to make some adaptation. Play ends, we come back, we kind of revisit what happened, and then we call a new play. And that's really S&OP. And we want to do that on a
Yeah,
monthly basis. And it's a monthly process because I use the term inertia. I think it's the right thing to use when we think about our supply chains and we think about capability and stuff. There's a certain amount of inertia in what our supply planning that we can't really react to. And so 1 month isn't a lot of time
yeah.
to be thinking, oh, I made a call at the beginning of the month. What happened at the end of the month? In that month, I can react to certain things, but those reactions have a higher cost
Yeah.
than if it's something that I'm planning out further into the future.
I don't want to take too much time on this because I know you have five more, but this is pretty much a non-negotiable for us. We don't do real time or whatever that means, S&OP. We don't even think that's a good idea. If it's even doable, which we don't think it is. We don't do semi-monthly S&OP. We don't do quarterly S&OP because none of those really make sense if you analyze the purpose of S&OP, the supply chain lead times, the responsiveness of the business. We just haven't run into anybody that where it ever made sense. I think it's more of a human capital thing, how do people react to the timing as much as it is a supply chain response time thing.
Well,
So that's just a point to
yeah,
make.
no, it's a good point, and the thing I would add to that is if you go back to this idea of strategy and execution, and going back to engaging the executive, if you're doing real time S&OP, you're going to be at a level of detail. If I'm an executive, I don't want to be involved in your real time S&OP because that's what I'm paying you to do,
Yeah.
right? I'm paying you to run the business on a day to day basis. I'm
Well,
not.
I like the
Yeah.
quote from an old client that DBM had a long time ago. If you would have told me I can run a multi-billion-dollar business that's very complex with a 1 hour meeting once a month, I would have told you you're crazy. And
Yep.
that's what S&OP should do, is enable you the rest of the month to support execution of what the play everyone is called. And if you're a good
Right.
football coach, then that's a big part of your job because you can't do the play. You have to coach
Right.
other people through it. So that I think is key to understanding with the monthly cadence. Even it's not
Yep.
about a monthly cadence. It's about uh, a way for the executive to support the execution of the entire organization around something. And we've had exactly zero projects in 10 years that do anything other than monthly. I mean, that's the
Right.
right way to.
It's the right cadence to support that accountability that we want to drive to. It's the right cadence to move from the unconstrained, because the process you move from an unconstrained demand view up to a supply view, then constrain your demand and do an executive. You want to go through that so everybody comes prepared. If you want to get to an hour and a half meeting once a month, it takes a fair amount of time to get to that point, right? That's the
Yeah.
culmination of the stuff that goes through that monthly cadence. So we'll talk about that in some detail. So the next one I wanted to touch on is the executive presentation. This is one that we get lots of questions on, like what should be in the executive presentation. And so if you think about it, I mentioned this already, the executive process is the executive presentation is the culmination of the monthly process. And this is your point where you're engaging that senior executive, right? So this is the part you've got to ask yourself, well, if they're not engaged, maybe the way that we're presenting things isn't right, or isn't
Not
getting
engaging.
the right thing.
Yeah.
So we it's not engaging. That's a good way to put it. So it's got to be a structured and focused presentation. And so the first thing I look at for this is you should be doing this family by family. I see this often where you come through, demand does, the sales team, they do all their
Mhm.
presentation related to the demand. And then it's kind of like we flip the script. And now I got the supply team doing all of their presentations related to supply. And so,
There's no
and that's the
connection. It's
problem.
really, I mean, you're an expert and have done it for years, and you can't follow it. I can't follow it, so uh,
And
it's
yep.
very difficult for the executive
And
to
and
follow
I
it.
mean, I've related this story to you a few times where I've sat in fairly mature processes beside the president, going through the presentation with them, and then I'll ask a question. I've done this, a little psych. How does that supply plan we just talked about? How does it link to what we talked on the demand side? And
No
nine
idea.
times out of 10, I've gotten the, well, I'm not exactly sure. And
Yeah,
that's a problem, right?
yeah, it is.
And so part of that is the nudging of them to say, well, it's really not acceptable for you to not be sure. But then how do you get your team to
Yeah.
present that? So it's got to be
Well, and
kind of,
hopefully people are starting to see how these are connected, because that connects
yep,
back to the family structure we've already addressed. Executive engagement would be asking questions about that. If they were engaged, they'd start wanting to know what the connections were between supply and demand, and how that
yep.
worked in the presentation.
And on that front, we use a very standard format, family to family. So instead of presenting it one way for one family and another way for another family, which means I've got to translate. If I'm sitting there in the meeting, I've got to translate what I saw for family A. Now I'm looking at a whole different set of charts for family B. And
Yeah,
now I got to think, okay, I'm flipping from one piece of the business to another piece of the business, follow a standard format, family by family, follow a standard set of charts, if you will, as you go through
yeah,
that. And so by using that common format and use the same format month to month, you might add some slides as things, different things come up. If you got new product introductions or
yeah.
stuff that's going on there, but stick to a standard format. If you
You're right.
want that meeting to be concise, meaningful, everybody walk out engaged, don't add a whole bunch of variables and stick to that family by family view.
Well, when we're brought in for existing S&OP process to improve them, usually we're we're finding they have way too much in the it's not that they need to add some slides to the deck. It's they need to remove 75% of them, and
Yep.
then get back to a standardized presentation where each family looks the same,
Probably
so that
anybody
everybody can
anybody
digest it.
on this, every organization goes through different changes and stuff like that. You have one, you got a president, now the next president comes in, I've got 7 slides that the old president likes, the new one doesn't even know what they mean. So you kind of go through those ones. So enough to say on the executive, we'll spend some time on the details of that, but that's another critical one. The other one I would say on there is planning horizon, and this one's fairly straightforward. The S&OP planning horizon, at a minimum, should be a 12-month rolling, and but at the it should also cover your cumulative supply chain lead time, because you think of those longer term decisions I need to make. I need to have a plan that covers that cumulative supply chain lead time, so I can use the direction that I'm going as a way to signal to my suppliers, my supply chain, where we're headed. So that's a big part of the planning horizon. And then there's got to be an understanding, and this is family, and that'll be family by family, but there's also got to be an understanding of kind of the planning zones, if you will. So, we'll often use the word frozen and firm, but it's understanding, we're in the in tight zone, what are the trade-offs to make changes within that. And so that's a pretty important part for everybody to be thinking through is to cover that side as part of the planning horizon. So it's the length of it, and then understanding kind of the flexibility within the different zones that you've got. The next one on my list of the big 8 is responsibility and accountability. And I've really touched on this, so I don't think I'll spend a lot of time on this now. But you can think about accountability as who is the senior executive expecting to deliver the results? And the responsibility would be, well, who's actually going to get it done, right? So I would say from an accountability perspective, the senior executive is accountable for the S&OP process. The S&OP coordinator is responsible to deliver that for them. The point on this one is 2 points on it. One is everybody should understand what they are, and they should understand what those are by family. And there should be no ambiguity on it, right? If you've got more than one, it's kind of hard to have more than one person accountable, because then you've got the old everybody points to everyone else. So that can be part of the challenge. So kind of covered those ones. If I look at really the other one that to me is pretty important is the supporting data for the process. And I say it this way because it doesn't necessarily need to be integrated completely tightly with your ERP system, although that would be fantastic. But the process should pull the data out of your ERP system.
Yeah.
And I say this because we spend millions and millions and millions of dollars on our ERP systems. And that is your system of record. And S&OP will be reflecting back to you what's happening with that system of record. And this is all about continuous improvement. And, Marshall, you've been in the meetings where we were dealing with companies that have a significant amount of past due backlog that we're pulling right out of their system based on their promise dates. And that's a problem, right? And that should be a point of concern for the senior executive to say, wait a second, if I've got all of that past due backlog, and that's by promise date, how are we actually communicating to our customers when they're going to get that product that's past due? And what's the process to do that? I should be able to pull that stuff out of my system. And so you want to be able to reflect it that way to help identify some of these areas for improvement that should be happening.
So you start again to see how these things all connect, because if your executive's involved in asking those questions, and that's clearly in the same sort of presentation every family you're looking at, then it's going to be the question is going to be forced. Like, what the most important thing we could be talking about for this family is how to get rid of this past due backlog and quit snow plowing. And so I think that's it's fun. You've done this so many times. It's not even funny, but it just always gets me excited because I start to see all the gears that combine, together to make an effective S&OP process, and they're interconnected. So,
and what's interesting to me on that data piece is often it's people in the organization that will be resistant to saying, I don't want to show that data. I just want to show them graphs. I have yet to meet an executive who, once they understand that you're following a standard format that looks the same from family to family, that's providing a holistic view of what's happening in that family with a demand plan and a supply plan and the buffers in between those which, is my inventory and my backlog, who doesn't, once they learn how to read that, who doesn't immediately then gravitate to that and start to go, oh, okay, I can now ask some pretty pointed questions without having to know all of the detail. And that's a big part of that standard format. That's why we use the 5-section sheet, right? Like it's got the bookings, shipments, backlog, production, inventory, includes capability, having all of that stuff in one place, because that can give you that picture that allows the executive to go, I can put my thumb right on this and understand what I'm seeing there. So
if you're hearing some thunder, that's on my side, not Doug's. I'm in the middle of St. Louis where we get weather occasionally. So loud weather.
Loud weather. All right. So the final one on this, and I kind of said, if I looked at it, those really 2 through 7 are the things that drive to that executive engagement. The measurements are pretty critical on how good things are, because the measurements are the things that will drive to improving how the business is run. And so when I think about measurements, it's not trying to penalize people because of measurements, but it's about using measurements to make sure the process is happening, make sure we're getting better at doing the process, and to make sure then that we're getting the results. So we always talk about, in this case, best practice on this. What does good look like? You've got a process measurement that just says, hey, are we doing all the meetings? Are all the people attending the meetings? Do we have all the data we need? The second one is an effectiveness measurement. Are we getting better at calling our plan, right? Of 1 month out, how good are we at creating our demand plans and our supply plans? And then the other one is tie your results to the families. Often I'll see people doing, oh, we're doing an on-time shipment, on-time delivery OTD measurement, but they're looking in aggregate. My argument is, hey, put that down to the family level. Then I can actually, it's very actionable then, right?
Actionably
Because
true. Yeah.
I'm managing the backlog, I'm managing the inventory, I'm seeing all that there, and I can manage it there. So put the measurements at that level.
So that kind of gets us back just to refresh to this. Whoops, let me get this out of the way here. Just this idea of measurable and actionable improvements for the process itself, which is kind of where you started, and then also for the KPIs in the business that you need to be taking a look at, that you're improving with the process.
Yep.
That thing.
Yep.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yep. So those are kind of the big eight, and kind of a bit of an introduction of what good looks like in each one of them. I mean, it's a lot to cover in this, but I think the takeaway I would say is, number one is ultimately what you've got to get to. Number 2 through
Right.
7 are the things that kind of support you getting to that level. And then the metrics is what really continues to drive the improvement and drive the behaviors that you want to do. I mean, there's a whole bunch of other stuff we could have talked about in here. You probably noticed I didn't spend a lot of time talking about, one of the big things is you have to have a system to do this. It's, there's some stuff that's implied in some things that, yeah, it makes things a lot easier. But if I look at it, it's a management process, which means management has to actually engage in the process in order for it to work. And so that is, these are the big eight as far as I can see.
Yeah, and then once they connect with that management process, they like to engage with it. They love to engage with it. It becomes the way they fundamentally run the business and execute strategy. So, well,
Yep.
good stuff. I'm excited about the next 8, and we might even take a couple of meeting or a couple of live streams on some of those. We might go beyond 8, but that's the plan, folks. If you want to come back 2 weeks from today, we'll do the next. It's August 11th, 3 p.m. Eastern, 2 p.m. Central. We'll do the first of the 8. Of the big 8 for what does good look like as far as S&OP. So any parting thoughts?
Well, I was just going to say, one of the things that we've been working together on is actually to provide an online assessment that's really kind of
Yes.
tied to these eight pieces. So if you didn't catch everything that we went through today, or you can't make all of the meetings or all of the live streams, I mean, obviously you can watch them at any point in time. But our intent is to kind of get that up in early August,
Yeah.
get that assessment up there. And it would just be a way for you to benchmark yourself kind of against these, and have some of these definitions that we go through. The other thing we're trying to do is, both on the BEZA website and the DBM website, is following these live streams probably a week later, to at least get an article up that kind of covers this topic up. So if you've got somebody in your organization who's doesn't want to necessarily sit and watch this, but wants to get it down in a short, sort of succinct way, we're trying to get those out as well. So, I mean, that would be all I had to say about that.
Okay. Well, I'm excited about the assessment. I'm glad you remembered. That is coming out. We'll do a big announcement on LinkedIn and YouTube, everywhere else that we have these streams. But we'll that's a self-assessment for S&OP that takes the ideas we're going to be going through over the next 5 to 6 months and puts them all into something you can use to kind of self-score. So, well, thanks again, Doug. It's exciting to have you back. And I just would remind everybody to like and subscribe, depending on which platform you're using. Maybe you follow, and that way you can see these, get reminded that you're going to need to see these in the future. But until August the 11th, when we do our next S&OP live stream, thank you very much. We'll see you later.
All right.